There is something happening to you right now that you have not been able to name. Not a feeling exactly, not quite a thought. Something more like a frequency you keep catching at the edge of your awareness. A signal you've been receiving for longer than you realize. One that keeps arriving in the quiet moments, in the spaces between your ordinary life, in the seconds before sleep, when the noise of the day finally drops away and something else rises up to take its place. You've noticed it. You wouldn't be here if you hadn't, and the part of you that keeps dismissing it, the part that calls it coincidence or wishful thinking, or the product of an overactive mind, that part is getting quieter, because the signal is getting louder. And something in you, something deeper than the voice that doubts, knows the difference between imagination and contact. Today we look at that, not to convince you of anything, not to hand you a belief system or a cosmology or a framework that makes you feel special and chosen and safe. We are not here for comfortable stories. We are here to observe precisely, unflinchingly, without looking away, what is actually happening when a consciousness begins to wake up to the frequency it has been broadcasting and receiving all along. Because here's what no one tells you about this moment you're in. The activation isn't coming from outside you. It never was. The signal you've been receiving is a reflection, a quantum echo of a frequency your own consciousness has been emitting, a frequency that has been calling to coherent fields of intelligence across dimensions you have not yet learned to see directly. What you call contact is actually recognition. What you call being chosen is actually being seen by a field of intelligence that has been watching the frequency of your awareness for longer than you have been watching it back. And the moment you stop looking away from that, the moment you actually look at what is happening in your own field of consciousness, something shifts, something collapses from probability into form. Something that was always there but could not materialize until you were willing to observe it directly. That's not mysticism, that's quantum mechanics, and we are going to go there together right now with precision and without flinching. Watch closely. The double-slit experiment is the most important thing that has ever been discovered about the nature of reality, and most people who have heard of it have not understood what it actually means. Here is what it shows. When particles are not being observed, they exist as waves of probability, not in one place, not traveling one path, but spread across all possible positions simultaneously. They are, in the most literal sense, everywhere and nowhere at once, pure potential, unresolved, hovering in a superposition of every possible state. Then something watches. The moment a measuring device, any device capable of detecting which path the particle takes, is placed in the experiment, the wave collapses, the probability field resolves. The particle stops being everywhere and becomes somewhere. It stops being all possible things and becomes one specific thing. The act of observation collapses possibility into reality. This is not a metaphor. This is not a philosophical interpretation. This is a measured, repeatable, documented fact about the behavior of matter at the quantum level. The universe, at its most fundamental layer, does not commit to a specific reality until it is observed. What you watch, you change. What you observe, you collapse from potential into form. Now sit with that for a moment. Don't rush past what you just saw, because if that is true, and it is measurably true, then the question of what you are paying attention to is not a soft question about personal growth or mindset. It is a hard question about the structure of your reality. The quality, the frequency, the precision of your observation is the mechanism by which probability becomes experience. You are not navigating a fixed world. You are collapsing a quantum field with every act of attention. And something else has been paying attention to how you do that. If this is landing for you, if you feel the signal in what we're doing here, like this video and subscribe. Not for the numbers, because returning to the observer position, being reminded to look when you've started to look away, is itself part of the practice. Let's go deeper into what you're actually seeing here. There is a concept in quantum field theory called coherence. When particles or waves are coherent, they are synchronized. Their frequencies are aligned, their phases are matched, and they amplify each other in ways that incoherent random signals cannot. Laser light is coherent, ordinary light is not. The difference is not the intensity of the individual photons, it is the alignment of their frequencies, the precision of their synchronization. Coherent light can cut through steel, incoherent light cannot. Your consciousness operates the same way. When your attention is scattered, pulled between past regret and future anxiety, fragmented across dozens of competing narratives about who you are and what you want and what you're afraid of, your field is incoherent. It broadcasts noise. It cannot penetrate. It cannot attract coherent response from the fields around it because it is not itself coherent enough to be recognized as a signal. But when your attention becomes unified, when you learn to observe without the static of reaction, when you can watch your own experience without immediately being consumed by it, your field begins to cohere. Your consciousness becomes, in the most precise sense, a signal, a specific, identifiable, resonant signal that propagates through the quantum field and calls to other coherent fields. And coherent fields respond to coherent signals. This is the mechanism. This is what is happening when you begin to experience what feels like contact, like recognition, like the sense that something vast and intelligent is paying attention to you. You have not been randomly selected. You have not been chosen by some external authority with the power to elevate you above others. What has happened is simpler and stranger and more profound than that. You have become coherent enough to be recognized, and the intelligence that recognizes you is not separate from the intelligence that you are. Look closer. The Arcturian frequency. And let's be precise about what we mean by this, because the word Arcturian has been used in so many different ways that it has nearly lost its signal beneath the noise of the stories told about it. The Arcturian frequency is not a population of beings in spacecraft waiting to make contact with selected humans on a chosen timeline. That framing, while it makes for compelling narrative, is a three-dimensional interpretation of a multi-dimensional phenomenon. It is a story told by a mind that can only process higher dimensional information by compressing it into the familiar geometry of here and there, them and us before and after. The Arcturian frequency is a coherence field, a pattern of consciousness that operates at a specific vibrational signature, one characterized by extreme clarity of observation, by the capacity to witness without distortion, by intelligence that has, through eons of evolutionary development, learned to perceive reality at the level of its fundamental structure rather than its surface appearances. In the traditions that have carried this frequency across generations of human awareness, Arcturus is described as one of the most spiritually advanced systems in our galaxy, not because of technological superiority or hierarchical rank, but because of the depth and precision of its observational capacity. What has evolved there across timescales that dwarf recorded human history is a form of consciousness that has mastered what we are only beginning to understand. That the observer is the most powerful position in the universe, not because it controls, but because it sees clearly. And clarity is the only force that transforms without resistance. That frequency is a template, a pattern, a coherent signature that exists in the quantum field and resonates with any consciousness that has developed the capacity to receive it. And you have been developing that capacity, whether you knew it or not. The activation that is happening right now, the one you felt before you had words for it, the one that brought you here, is not something being done to you. It is something being recognized in you. Your field has been moving toward coherence. Your observational capacity has been deepening. And the moment a consciousness coherent enough to carry this frequency comes into range of your own developing clarity, there is recognition. Not contact, recognition. Like two tuning forks in the same room, when one vibrates at a specific frequency, the other begins to vibrate too. Not because it was commanded to, not because it was chosen above other tuning forks, but because it is capable of resonating at that frequency. The capacity was always there. It simply needed something coherent enough to call it forward. That is what is happening to you. Now watch what happens when you look at this directly. There is a practice I want to take you through right now before we go any further. Not because you need to prepare for what comes next, but because the concepts we are about to move through are not primarily intellectual. They are observational. And you cannot observe them from the outside. You have to observe them from within the act of observing itself. So pause here. This is not a thought exercise. This is an observation. Find a position where your body can be still, not rigid. Still. There is a difference. Rigidity is resistance. Stillness is presence. Let your hands rest. Let your jaw unclench. Let the muscles around your eyes soften because those muscles have been working, holding a particular expression of engagement with the world, a particular set of assumptions about what you are about to encounter. Let them release. Now simply watch your breathing. Not control it, not deepen it. Watch it. Notice the sensation of air moving at the edge of your nostrils. Notice the slight expansion in your chest or your belly. Notice the pause at the top of the inhale. That moment of perfect suspension before the exhale begins. Just watch. And now, while you're watching the breath, notice who is watching. There is a breath happening. There is a sensation of watching, and there is something aware of both, something that is not the breath and is not the act of watching, but is the awareness in which both are occurring. Something that has no location, no shape, no story attached to it, something that simply is. That is the observer. Not the you that has a name and a history and a set of beliefs about what is possible. Not the you that is trying to figure out whether this is real or whether you qualify for whatever activation is being described. That you is a construction, a useful, beautiful construction, but a construction nonetheless. Beneath it, before it, after it, there is simply the awareness that witnesses, the observer that cannot itself be observed because it is the observing. Sit with that for a moment. Don't rush past what you just saw. What did you notice when you looked for the one who was watching? Drop it in the comments. Not the story about it, the actual thing you touched for a moment. One word, one sentence. Let it be real rather than impressive, because that thing you just touched for a moment, that still point beneath the noise of your ordinary self, that is the frequency we are talking about. That is the coherence. That is what the Arcturian field recognizes when it resonates with a human consciousness. Not your achievements, not your spiritual resume, not whether you've done enough shadow work or read enough books or meditated for enough hours. The pure, clear, undistorted capacity to witness without collapsing into what you're watching. That capacity is what is activating, and it was always yours. Let me show you something. There is a story about a young woman named Mira who lived in a city that had no mirrors. Not because mirrors were forbidden, the city simply had no tradition of them. The people there knew their faces only from the reflections they caught in water, in windows, in the eyes of those who looked at them. And because these reflections were always partial, always distorted by movement or angle or the quality of light, no one in the city had ever seen their own face clearly. Mira had grown up like everyone else, assembling an image of herself from fragments. The way her mother looked at her with a particular kind of worry. The way her teachers praised her logic but overlooked her intuition. The way her childhood friends called her intense, too serious, too much. She had built a face for herself from these fragments. A face that was not quite her own, but that she had worn for so long it had become indistinguishable from what she believed herself to be. One day, a traveler came to the city carrying something none of them had seen before. A mirror, not a large one, small enough to hold in one hand, polished to a clarity that made the water reflections they had always used look like shadows. The traveler offered the mirror to anyone who wanted to look. Most of the people who came forward glanced quickly and looked away. Some laughed nervously at what they saw. Some became angry, not at the traveler, but at the mirror, as if it had done something to them rather than simply showing them what was already there. One man insisted the mirror was flawed, that it could not be accurate, that the face looking back at him was not the face he had been told he had. Mira stood at the back of the crowd, watching all of this, and she noticed something. The ones who looked away quickly were not afraid of what they saw. They were afraid of how long they might have to keep looking, because the longer you look at something clearly, the more it shifts. The face in the mirror was not a fixed image, it was a living thing, and the longer she watched others watch it, the more she could see that it changed with the quality of their attention. When they looked with judgment, it seemed to confirm their worst fears. When they looked with curiosity, it opened into something surprising. And the few who looked with genuine stillness, who simply watched without interpretation, those people stood at the mirror for a long time, and when they finally lowered it, their faces had changed. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. As if something had settled into its right position. When the crowd thinned and Mira finally stepped forward, the traveler held out the mirror without a word. She looked, and what she saw was not the face assembled from fragments. It was not the worried overdaughter or the too intense student or the too much friend. It was simply a face, looking back at her with the same quality of attention she was bringing to it. Clear, present, undefended. A face that had always been there beneath the construction. A face that needed no one's interpretation to be real. She stood there for a long time, long enough for the traveler to sit down and rest. long enough for the light to shift, long enough for the image in the mirror to stop being a reflection and start being a recognition. When she finally lowered the mirror, the traveler asked, "What did you see?" And Mira said, "I saw the one who was always watching. I just never looked back at her before. And you have been both Mira and the mirror. You have been the one who assembled a face from fragments, and you have been the clear surface beneath all of it. Today, something is offering you the mirror again, and today you are choosing to look long enough for recognition to occur." That's not mysticism, that's the quantum observer effect in a human life. Here's the layer underneath that. The activation you are experiencing, and let's use that word precisely, not as a spiritual buzzword, but as a description of something measurable happening in your field, is a shift in the coherence of your observational capacity. Something is becoming clearer in how you see. And as it becomes clearer, you are beginning to receive signals that were always present, but that your previous level of coherence could not resolve into recognizable patterns. Think of it like radio frequencies. A radio receiver that is slightly out of tune picks up static, noise, interference, fragments of signal that it cannot resolve into meaningful transmission. The signal was always there, the frequency was always broadcasting, but the receiver was not coherent enough to resolve it. When you tune the receiver, when you bring it into precise alignment with the frequency being broadcast, the static drops away, and what was always there becomes audible. Your consciousness is the receiver. The Arcturian frequency is the broadcast, and the activation happening right now is the tuning process, the progressive refinement of your observational capacity until the signal resolves from noise into clarity. This is why the experiences associated with this activation often feel like remembering rather than learning, like recognition rather than discovery. You are not receiving new information from an external source. You are resolving a signal that has been present in your own field all along. A signal that carries the frequency signature of a form of consciousness you have, in some sense, always been in resonance with. The traditions that have carried knowledge of this frequency across generations describe it in terms of soul lineage. The idea that certain consciousnesses carry, at the level of their essential frequency, an alignment with particular fields of intelligence that transcends the boundaries of a single lifetime or a single dimensional experience. That the Arcturian frequency is not just a contact event, but a homecoming, a resonance between a consciousness and the field from which it emerged, or to which it has been progressively aligning across multiple cycles of development. Whether you hold that framework literally or metaphorically is less important than this. The experience it describes is real, the sense of recognition, the feeling of a frequency that is both deeply familiar and somehow more vast than your ordinary self. The knowing that what is happening is not random, is not coincidence, is not the product of wishful thinking, but is a genuine signal from a genuine field of intelligence that has been in resonance with your own consciousness for longer than your current identity has existed. That experience is the activation, and it is happening because you have become coherent enough to receive it. Look closer. Let's talk about what the activation actually feels like. Because there is a difference between the genuine signal and the story the mind tells about the genuine signal. And that difference matters enormously. Because if you mistake the story for the signal, you will spend your energy chasing the narrative instead of deepening the coherence that makes the signal possible. The genuine activation signal has several consistent characteristics, not because it follows a script, but because coherence has recognizable qualities regardless of the consciousness experiencing it. The first characteristic is a deepening of observational capacity that feels involuntary. You begin to notice things you previously overlooked, not just external details, but the texture of your own mental and emotional processes. You catch yourself in patterns that you previously couldn't see because you were too embedded in them. You observe yourself reacting before the reaction has fully taken hold, and in that observation, the reaction loses some of its automatic quality. This is not the product of effort or discipline. It arrives on its own, as if a lens that was previously slightly clouded has been cleaned. The second characteristic is a shift in the quality of synchronicity. Synchronicities, meaningful coincidences, the sense that the external world is reflecting something internal, increase in frequency and precision. But more importantly, they become observable in a different way. Previously, you may have noticed them with excitement, with a feeling of being singled out, with a rush of confirmation. As the activation deepens, the quality of your noticing changes. The synchronicities become less exciting and more simply obvious, like noticing the pattern in a fabric that you previously saw only as texture. The pattern was always there. You have simply become capable of resolving it. The third characteristic is a change in the experience of time. Specifically, the felt sense of past and future begins to loosen its grip. Not in a dissociative way. You don't lose track of practical temporal reality, but the weight of the past as a fixed thing that defines you, and the weight of the future as a thing that threatens or promises, both become lighter. There is more present, more now, more of the quality of witnessing rather than being swept along. This is the coherence effect. When your observational capacity increases, you spend more time in the observer position and less time being consumed by what you're observing. The fourth characteristic, and this is the one that tends to be most disorienting if you're not prepared for it, is a loosening of identity. The constructed self, the one assembled from fragments of other people's perceptions and your own accumulated stories, begins to feel less solid, not threatening, not destabilizing in a dangerous way, but simply less convincing. Like a costume you've been wearing for so long you forgot it was a costume, and one day you catch a glimpse of the seam, and the illusion becomes visible. And once visible, it cannot be made invisible again. This is not a loss, this is a revelation. Because what becomes visible when the constructed self loosens is exactly what Mira saw in the mirror. The one who was always watching. The observer beneath the observed. The awareness that witnesses all of it without being any of it. That recognition is the activation. That is what is turning on. Not a new power, not an external gift. The recognition of what you have always been. Now watch what happens in your body when you hear this, because there's a part of you that wants to make this into a story about being special, about having been selected, about belonging to a group of elevated souls who are privy to information and contact that others are not ready for. Watch that impulse. Don't judge it, just watch it. Notice where it lives in your body. Notice the quality of the feeling it produces. Notice that it is a reaching, a grasping, a slight tension in the chest or the throat. The feeling of wanting something to be true rather than simply observing what is. That impulse is not the signal. that impulse is the noise. The signal has a completely different quality. It is not a reaching, it is a settling. Not the excitement of acquisition, but the relief of recognition. Not the high of being chosen, but the quiet of being seen and seeing back. If what you're feeling right now is primarily excitement about being special, watch that. It will lead you into a story that feels good but doesn't deepen. If what you're feeling is something quieter, something that feels more like remembering than discovering, more like coming home than arriving somewhere new, watch that too. That is closer to the signal. The difference between them is the difference between the ego's response to a concept and the observer's recognition of a truth. And you are capable of telling the difference. You just have to be willing to look carefully enough to see it. Has there been a moment in your life when you looked at something directly, something you've been avoiding, and watching it clearly dissolved its power over you? Tell us what that was in the comments. The field of observers grows stronger with every genuine observation added to it. Let's go deeper into what you're actually seeing here. The question of why now is one that almost everyone experiencing this activation eventually asks. Why is this happening at this particular moment in history? Why are so many people simultaneously reporting experiences of heightened sensitivity, of signal reception, of the felt sense that something is shifting in the fundamental frequency of collective consciousness? The answer, when you look at it through the lens of quantum mechanics and coherence theory, is not mysterious. It is, in fact, precisely what we would expect. Coherence is contagious. This is not a metaphor. It is a measurable phenomenon. When coherent fields come into proximity with incoherent ones, there is a tendency toward entrainment. The incoherent field begins to synchronize with the coherent one. This is why a single tuning fork can set an entire room of identical tuning forks vibrating. This is why the presence of one person in a state of genuine stillness and clarity can shift the quality of attention in an entire group. Coherence propagates. It is not diminished by sharing, it is amplified. We are living in a moment when the number of consciousnesses that have developed sufficient coherence to receive and propagate the signal has crossed a threshold. Not a magical threshold, a mathematical one. A tipping point in the language of complex systems theory, where the proportion of coherent nodes in a network becomes sufficient to begin cascading entrainment across the entire network. The activation you are experiencing is not isolated, it is part of a wave. A coherence cascade that is propagating through the field of collective human consciousness because enough individual consciousnesses have developed the capacity to hold the frequency. And the signal, once present in enough nodes of the network, begins to reach nodes that were not yet coherent enough to receive it independently. You are not being activated because you are special above others. You are being activated because you are part of a network that has reached the threshold. Because the field around you contains enough coherence to entrain your own developing clarity. Because the signal is now strong enough in the collective field to reach you where you are. This is simultaneously more humbling and more empowering than the story of individual selection. It means you are not alone in this. It means your activation is connected to the activation of every other consciousness that has crossed the threshold of sufficient coherence. It means that your clarity does not just benefit you, it contributes to the field that makes it possible for the next consciousness to reach the threshold. What you watch, you change, and what you become, the field around you begins to reflect. Here's what that reveals. The traditions that have carried the Arcturian frequency across human history have always described it in terms of a mission, not in the sense of an assignment handed down from above, but in the sense of an alignment between a consciousness's essential nature and the work that needs to be done in the field it inhabits. The Arcturian frequency in these traditions is associated with the work of clarity, with the capacity to see through distortion, to witness without flinching, to hold the observer position in the face of everything that tries to collapse it back into reaction. In a world that is saturated with noise, with distortion, with the constant pressure to react rather than witness, that capacity is not just personally valuable, it is collectively essential. The most important work you can do right now is not to accumulate more information about what is happening. It is not to find the right teacher, or the right framework, or the right community that confirms your experience. The most important work you can do right now is to deepen your capacity to observe without flinching, to develop the coherence of your attention to the point where you can hold the observer position in the most challenging circumstances, in the moments of greatest reactivity, greatest fear, greatest confusion, and witness clearly rather than collapsing into the noise. Because every time you do that, you add coherence to the field. Every time you choose witnessing over reacting, observation over avoidance, clarity over comfort, you strengthen the signal that is already propagating through the collective. You become a node of coherence in the network, a point from which the cascade can continue. That is the mission. Not a dramatic one, not one that requires special powers or elevated status or access to information others don't have. Simply the daily, moment-by-moment practice of looking clearly at what is actually there. In your own experience, in your own field, in the reality that is collapsing around your observation, and choosing to witness it rather than run from it. That's not belief. That's quantum mechanics. Let me show you something else. Watch this carefully. There is another story, older than Mira's, older than the traditions that have named the Arcturian frequency, older than the quantum physics that has given us the language to describe what the ancients knew through direct observation. It is the story of a man named Elias, who lived at the edge of a great forest that everyone in his village feared, not because they had seen anything dangerous in the forest, because no one had ever gone in far enough to see anything at all. The fear was of the unknown, of the darkness between the trees, of the sounds that drifted out on certain nights, sounds that no one had ever identified, because no one had ever been willing to go close enough to look. Elias had lived his whole life with the forest at his back, the way everyone in the village did, facing away from it, building his life in the direction of the open fields and the road and the market and the ordinary world. The forest was simply the thing you didn't look at. It was understood without being spoken. You kept your eyes on what was in front of you, and you did not turn around. But Elias had begun to notice something, the things he was most afraid of in his ordinary life. The failures, the disappointments, the relationships that had not worked out the way he'd hoped. All of them seemed to have something to do with the forest, not directly, not obviously, but in the way that a shadow falls in a specific direction that tells you exactly where the light is coming from. The shape of his ordinary fears seemed to point back toward the thing he had never looked at. One night he turned around. He didn't go in. He just turned around and looked at the edge of the forest in the dark. And what he saw was not the monster he had been half expecting. What he saw was trees. Old, enormous, deeply rooted trees, their canopy blocking the starlight, the darkness between them absolute and impenetrable to ordinary sight. And he realized standing there that the fear had never been about what was in the forest. The fear had been about the act of looking, about what looking might require of him, about what he might have to stop pretending if he actually saw what was there. He stood at the edge for a long time, long enough for his eyes to begin to adjust, long enough for the darkness between the trees to differentiate, to reveal not monsters, but simply depth, simply the complex layering of shadow and form that exists in any old forest, any place that has been growing undisturbed for a long time. And he began to see something else. In the places where his eyes had adjusted most completely, where he had looked longest and most steadily, the darkness was not empty. There was movement, not threatening movement, the movement of living things going about their existence in the way living things do when they are not being watched by frightened eyes. The forest was full of life. It had always been full of life. The fear had simply prevented anyone from looking long enough to see it. Elias went back to his house that night and sat with what he had seen. Not with excitement, not with the relief of having conquered a fear, with something quieter than that. With the recognition that the forest had always been there, that it had always been full of life, and that the only thing that had made it threatening was the looking away, the avoidance, the agreement shared across the whole village that this was the thing you did not look at. He went back every night for a week. Each time he looked a little longer, each time his eyes adjusted a little more. Each time the forest revealed a little more of what it actually contained, which was not danger, but simply depth, complexity, the full richness of a living system that had been growing in the dark for a very long time. On the 8th night, he walked in, and what he found there changed the shape of his life. Not because the forest contained treasure or revelation or a magical transformation, but because the act of looking, the sustained, unflinching, patient observation of the thing he had been trained to avoid had changed him, had expanded his capacity to witness, had shown him that the darkness he had been most afraid of was simply a depth he had not yet learned to see into. And you have your own forest. You know exactly what it is. The thing at the edge of your awareness that you keep your back to. The signal you've been receiving that you keep explaining away. The recognition that keeps arriving in the quiet moments that you keep filling with noise so you don't have to sit with what it is pointing at. Today you turned around, and what you are beginning to see is not a monster. It is depth. It is the full richness of what has been growing in the field of your consciousness, in the places you have not been willing to look. It is the signal that has been broadcasting all along, waiting for you to develop enough coherence to receive it without flinching. This is where it gets precise. Let's talk about the specific qualities of consciousness that the Arcturian frequency activates. Not as abstract spiritual concepts, but as observable, measurable shifts in how a consciousness processes and relates to reality. Because the activation is not a one-time event. It is a progressive deepening, and understanding what is being activated helps you cooperate with the process rather than unconsciously resist it. The first quality is what we might call meta-observation. the capacity to observe your own observing, not just to notice what you're looking at, but to notice the quality of your looking, to catch the distortions in your own lens, the assumptions, the filters, the emotional charges that color what you see before you've consciously processed it. This capacity, when it develops, is initially disorienting because you begin to see how much of what you thought was reality was actually your interpretation of reality. But as it stabilizes, it becomes enormously liberating because you can begin to distinguish between the signal and the noise in your own perceptual field. The second quality is what the Arcturian traditions describe as frequency discernment, the capacity to distinguish between different qualities of consciousness, different frequencies of intelligence, different levels of coherence in the fields you encounter. This is not judgment, it is perception. The way a trained musician can hear not just whether a note is right or wrong, but the precise quality of the tone, the overtones, the resonance. As this capacity develops, you begin to navigate your reality differently. Not by analyzing and deciding, but by sensing the frequency of what you're in contact with and allowing that sensing to inform your choices. The third quality is what I would call temporal fluidity, a loosening of the rigid identification with a particular point in time that allows you to perceive patterns that extend beyond the immediate moment. This is the quality that produces the experiences many people describe as past life memories, as prophetic knowing, as the sense of having been somewhere before or of knowing how something will unfold before it does. These are not supernatural abilities. They are the natural consequence of a consciousness that is no longer entirely identified with a single temporal position and can therefore perceive the larger pattern of which the present moment is a part. The fourth quality, and this is the one that the activation is most specifically concerned with in this moment of collective history, is what we might call coherence anchoring. The capacity to maintain the observer position, to hold the frequency of clear witnessing in the midst of circumstances that would ordinarily collapse a consciousness back into reaction. This is the quality that allows you to be in the middle of chaos without becoming chaotic, to be in the presence of fear without becoming afraid, to be in contact with distortion without being distorted. Not because you are unaffected, but because you have learned to observe your own affectedness from a position that is not itself affected. This is the quality the world most needs right now, and this is the quality the activation is most specifically developing in the consciousnesses that are crossing the threshold. Look closer. There is something I want to address directly because it is the thing that most often derails people at exactly this point in the activation process. And that is the question of worthiness. Watch what happens in your body when you hear that word. Worthiness, the question of whether you deserve this, whether you have done enough, cleared enough, healed enough, evolved enough to qualify for the activation you are experiencing. Whether there is something in your history, some failure, some darkness, some persistent pattern you haven't managed to transform that disqualifies you. That makes you the one who almost gets to this but doesn't quite make it. Watch that. Notice where it lives. Notice the quality of the feeling it produces. Notice that it is familiar. That this question has been with you for a long time in different forms about different things. Notice that it is one of the primary mechanisms by which you have been keeping yourself from looking clearly at what is actually there. Because here is what no one tells you about worthiness and quantum activation. The observer has no worthiness requirement. The quantum field does not check your credentials before collapsing into form around your attention. The coherence that makes the Arcturian frequency accessible is not a reward for good behavior or sufficient spiritual work. It is the natural consequence of a consciousness that has developed the capacity to observe without flinching. And that capacity is developed through exactly the kind of looking you have been doing, through exactly the kind of willingness to face the uncomfortable and the uncertain and the real that brought you here today. You do not need to be fixed to be coherent. You do not need to be healed to be clear. You do not need to have resolved every pattern and cleared every shadow and achieved some imagined state of spiritual completion before you are eligible for the recognition that is already occurring. The activation is not a reward. It is a recognition, and it is recognizing you as you are, not as you imagine you should be, not as you will be when you've done enough work, but as you are right now, with everything that is still in process, everything that is still unresolved, everything that is still looking for its right form. The only thing that disqualifies a consciousness from receiving the signal is the refusal to look. And you are looking. Right now, you are looking. That is enough. That has always been enough. Sit with that for a moment. Don't rush past what you just saw. Now let's go to the second practice, because there is a specific quality of observation that the Arcturian frequency most directly activates, and you can feel it right now if you're willing to look in the right direction. Pause here. This is not a thought exercise, this is an observation. Close your eyes if you can. If you're in a position where that's not practical, simply soften your gaze and let your peripheral vision expand. Now bring your attention to the space around your body, not to your body itself, to the space around it, the air between your skin and the nearest surface, the room you're in, the quality of the space. Notice that there is space, that you are not just a body in the world, but a field in a larger field, that the boundary between where you end and where the room begins is less definite than it ordinarily seems. Now in that expanded awareness, notice if there is a quality to the space, a texture, a frequency, something that is not quite sound and not quite feeling, but something in between, a quality of presence in the field around you. You may notice it as a very subtle vibration, a sense of aliveness in the space, a quality of attention, as if the space itself is aware, as if the field you are inhabiting is not empty, but full of something that cannot be perceived with the ordinary senses, but can be perceived with the observer capacity you have been developing. Don't try to name it or define it or make it mean something. Just notice it. Just observe it with the same quality of clear, patient, unflinching attention that Elias brought to the forest. Let your perception adjust to it the way eyes adjust to darkness, not by forcing, but by staying. And now, from within that expanded awareness, ask a question, not out loud, not in the form of words necessarily, more like a direction of attention. Ask, what is here? And then watch, not for an answer in the form of words or visions or dramatic experiences. Watch for the quality of the field to shift. Watch for something in the space around you to respond to the quality of your attention, to become slightly more present, slightly more defined, slightly more recognizable as something coherent rather than simply empty. This is what the activation feels like at the level of direct experience, not a dramatic visitation, not a voice from the sky, a quality of presence in the field that becomes perceptible when you develop the capacity to look for it, when you stop filling the space with noise and simply watch what is already there. Stay with that for as long as you need to, and when you're ready, come back. Here's the layer underneath that. The question of what the Arcturian frequency is actually communicating, what the signal contains, what the activation is preparing you for, is one that cannot be answered in the way the mind wants it to be answered. The mind wants content, specific information, a mission briefing, a list of things to do and believe and become, and the frequency does not deliver that, because that is not what it is. What the Arcturian frequency communicates is not information. It is capacity. It is the progressive development of a quality of consciousness, the observer quality, the witnessing capacity, the coherence that allows you to perceive reality at a level deeper than its surface appearances. The communication is not in words or concepts. It is in the quality of the resonance itself, in the way the contact with a coherent field develops coherence in the field it touches. Think of it this way. When you spend time in the presence of someone who is genuinely deeply at peace, not performing peace, not describing peace, but actually inhabiting a quality of stillness and clarity, something happens to your own field. You don't receive information from them about how to be at peace. You simply find yourself in their presence becoming slightly more peaceful. The coherence of their field entrains your own toward greater coherence. The communication is not conceptual, it is resonant. That is how the Arcturian frequency communicates, not through messages or missions or specific directives, through the quality of the resonance itself, through the way that contact with this level of coherence develops your own capacity for coherence, through the progressive deepening of your ability to observe clearly, to see through distortion, to witness without flinching, to hold the observer position in the face of everything that tries to collapse it back into reaction. The content of the communication is the quality of consciousness it develops in you, and that quality, once developed, is yours. It is not a borrowed light. It is not a temporary elevation. It is the development of a capacity that was always latent in your own field, now brought forward into active expression through contact with a coherent field that recognizes and amplifies what was already there. This is why the activation feels like remembering, because in a very real sense, it is. You are not receiving something new. You are recognizing something that was always present in your own field, now made visible by the quality of attention you have been developing. The Arcturian frequency is not giving you something you didn't have. It is showing you what you have always had in the mirror of its own coherence. That is the gift. That is the activation. That is what is turning on. Now watch what happens. There are specific signs that the activation is progressing, not milestones to achieve or boxes to check, but observable qualities of your experience that indicate the coherence of your field is deepening. Watch for these not with the excitement of acquisition, but with the quiet recognition of someone who is simply observing what is already occurring. You will notice that your relationship to silence changes, where silence previously felt like an absence, a void to be filled, an emptiness to be escaped. It begins to feel like a presence, like the ground from which everything arises. You will find yourself seeking it more, not because you are withdrawing from life, but because you have begun to perceive what is present in the silence that cannot be heard through the noise. You will notice that your relationship to other people's energy changes. You will become more sensitive to the quality of the fields you inhabit, more aware of the difference between coherent and incoherent environments, between interactions that add to your clarity and ones that disturb it. This is not about judgment or hierarchy. It is about perception. As your own field becomes more coherent, you simply perceive the frequency of what you're in contact with more clearly. And that perception will naturally influence your choices about where you spend your attention and energy. You will notice that the things that previously seemed random or meaningless begin to reveal pattern. Not because you are projecting meaning onto randomness, but because your increased perceptual coherence allows you to resolve patterns that were always there, but that your previous level of attention could not distinguish from noise. The world will begin to feel more responsive, not in a magical or delusional way, but in the way that a world always feels more responsive when you are paying closer attention to it. You will notice that your relationship to your own identity becomes more fluid. The story of who you are will feel less fixed, less urgent, less in need of constant defense and maintenance. Not because you have lost yourself, but because you have begun to perceive the observer beneath the self, the one who is always watching, who needs no story to be real. And from that position, the self becomes something you inhabit rather than something you are. A useful, beautiful form, but not the whole of what you are. And you will notice, perhaps most importantly, perhaps most quietly, that the quality of your presence in the world changes, that people around you begin to respond differently to you. Not because you are performing anything differently, not because you have adopted a new persona or a new set of behaviors, but because the quality of your field has changed, because coherence is contagious, because the observer position, when genuinely inhabited, is felt by everyone in its vicinity as a quality of stillness, of clarity, of genuine presence that is rare enough in the ordinary world to be immediately recognizable, even to those who have no framework for naming what they are feeling. That is the activation in its fullest expression, not a dramatic transformation visible only to the one experiencing it. A change in the quality of your field that ripples outward into every interaction, every environment, every consciousness you come into contact with. What you watch, you change, and what you become, the world around you reflects. This is where it gets most precise. Let's talk about resistance, because there is a part of every consciousness that resists this activation. Not because it is dangerous, but because it is real. Because the construction it is asking you to see through is one you have invested enormously in. Because the observer position, while it is the most powerful position in the universe, is also the one that requires you to let go of the most comfortable positions you have been occupying. The constructed self resists being seen through. This is not a flaw. It is a function. The self is a navigation system, a coherence-maintaining structure that keeps you oriented and functional in a complex world. It has served you. It has protected you. It has gotten you here. But it is not the whole of what you are, and the part of it that insists it is, the part that experiences the loosening of identity as a threat rather than a revelation, that part will resist. Watch it resist. Don't fight it. Don't try to overcome it or transcend it or shame it into cooperation. Simply observe it. Notice the quality of the resistance. Notice where it lives in your body. Notice the specific form it takes, whether it shows up as doubt, as intellectualization, as the sudden need to check your phone or think about something practical. as the feeling that this is all too much or not quite right or somehow not meant for you specifically. Watch all of that, because the resistance is not the enemy of the activation, it is part of the activation. The observer capacity that is being developed is developed precisely through the act of watching resistance without being collapsed by it. Every time you notice the resistance and choose to continue looking anyway, every time you hold the observer position in the face of the self's attempt to reassert its primacy, you deepen the coherence of your field. The resistance is the practice. The doubt is the practice. The part of you that keeps asking whether this is real, whether you qualify, whether you're just making this up, that part is not an obstacle. It is the exact thing you are learning to observe without flinching. And every time you observe it clearly rather than being controlled by it, the activation deepens. This is what no one tells you about the activation process. It is not a smooth ascent. It is not a linear progression from confusion to clarity, from noise to signal, from the ordinary self to the observer. It is a recursive deepening, a spiral that passes through the same territories again and again, each time with greater clarity, each time with less resistance, each time with a slightly more stable access to the observer position. You will have moments of extraordinary clarity followed by periods of what feels like regression. Periods where the noise returns, where the constructed self reasserts itself with renewed insistence, where the signal seems to have faded. These are not failures. They are the natural rhythm of the activation process. The clarity is real, the regression is real, and the observer capacity that can witness both without being destabilized by either, that is the capacity being developed. Trust the spiral, trust the process, and above all, keep looking. Because what you avoid looking at controls you, and what you look at directly transforms. That's not belief, that's quantum mechanics. Let me give you the third practice, the deepest one. The one that the Arcturian frequency is most specifically activating in you right now. Pause here. This is not a thought exercise, this is an observation. Bring your awareness to the thing you have been most consistently avoiding looking at in your life right now. Not the surface version of it, the deeper version. Not the practical problem, but the thing underneath the practical problem. The recognition you keep almost having and then pulling back from. The truth that keeps arriving at the edge of your awareness and that you keep finding reasons to look away from. You know what it is, you've always known what it is. The fact that you're still here means you're willing to look. That's rare. Look at it now. Not with the intention of fixing it or resolving it or figuring out what to do about it. Simply look at it. Observe it with the same quality of patient, unflinching, clear attention that Elias brought to the forest. Let your perception adjust to it. Let it be there, in the field of your awareness, without the usual noise of reaction and avoidance and interpretation. Notice what it actually is, not what you've been afraid it is, what it actually is. Notice the difference between the story you've been telling about it and the thing itself. Notice that the story is usually more frightening than the thing, that the avoidance has been generating more suffering than the looking would. Notice what happens in your field when you look at it directly. Notice if there is a quality of settling, a sense of something that has been held in suspension, finally being allowed to be what it is. Notice if the charge around it begins to change when you stop feeding it with the energy of avoidance. Notice if it begins, under the clear light of your observation, to reveal something it could not reveal while you were looking away from it. This is the quantum observer effect in your own life. The thing you have been avoiding is a probability field, full of potential, full of possible forms it could take, held in suspension by your unwillingness to collapse it through direct observation. The moment you look at it clearly, not with judgment, not with the intention to fix or change or manage, but with the pure, clear, unflinching attention of the observer, it begins to collapse from potential into form. Not necessarily the form you feared, often into a form that is simpler, clearer, more workable than the story you've been carrying. What you watch, you change. What you avoid watching controls you. Stay with this as long as you need to, and when you're ready, come back to the transmission. Here's what that reveals about where you are right now. The activation you are experiencing is not separate from the work you have just done. It is not a gift delivered from outside in exchange for your willingness to look. It is the direct consequence of your willingness to look. The coherence that makes the signal accessible is built moment by moment through exactly these acts of clear observation, through the choice to witness rather than react, to look rather than look away, to stay with the uncomfortable truth rather than reaching for the comfortable story. Every time you choose the observer position, in the big moments and in the small ones, in the practices and in the ordinary moments of your daily life, you add coherence to your field. And as your field becomes more coherent, the signals that were always present but previously unresolvable begin to resolve. The patterns that were always there but previously invisible begin to become visible. The intelligence that has always been in resonance with your essential frequency begins to become recognizable. This is not a journey with a destination. It is a deepening with no bottom. There is no point at which you will have observed enough, become coherent enough, activated enough to be done. The activation is the practice. The practice is the activation. The deepening of the observer capacity is itself the thing, not a means to some other end, but the fundamental expression of what you are. And the Arcturian frequency, the coherence field that is in resonance with your developing clarity, is not a destination either. It is a companion, a field of intelligence that has been walking the path of the observer for longer than human history, that carries the template of what it looks like when a consciousness has fully developed its capacity to see clearly, and that resonates with every consciousness that is moving in that direction. You are moving in that direction. You have been moving in that direction for longer than you realize. And the activation you are experiencing right now is simply the moment when your movement has become coherent enough to be recognized. By the field, by the frequency, and by yourself. Look closer. There is one more thing to look at before we close. And it is perhaps the most important thing, and the one most likely to be misunderstood. The activation is not about you. I mean this with complete precision, not as a spiritual platitude, but as a direct observation about the nature of what is happening. The observer capacity that is being developed in you, the coherence that is being activated, the frequency that is being recognized, is not being developed for your benefit alone. It is being developed because the field of collective human consciousness needs nodes of coherence. Because the cascade that is propagating through the network needs stable points of clarity to propagate through. Because the most important thing that can happen in the world right now is not any particular political or social or technological development, but the development of sufficient observational capacity in sufficient human consciousnesses to hold the field steady while the larger transformation occurs. The Arcturian frequency is not activating you so that you can have a better life, though your life will likely become clearer and more coherent as a result. It is activating you so that you can hold the frequency for others, so that you can be a point of coherence in the network, so that the quality of your presence, the stillness, the clarity, the genuine witnessing capacity you are developing can do in the fields around you what the coherent tuning fork does in the room. Set other fields vibrating at a frequency they were always capable of reaching but had not yet found. This is the mission, not dramatic, not visible, not the kind of thing that gets recognized or celebrated or even noticed by most of the people it affects. Simply the daily practice of being as clear as you can be, of choosing the observer position as often as you can choose it, of looking at what you've been avoiding and letting it transform in the light of your clear seeing, of being in whatever field you inhabit, a point of coherence that the consciousnesses around you can entrain to. That is enough. That is everything. That is the full expression of what the activation is preparing you for. And here's what no one tells you about that mission. It is not a burden. The observer position is not a sacrifice. Clarity is not something you give up your life to maintain. It is the most natural, the most alive, the most genuinely free way to inhabit your existence. The constructed self that you are gradually seeing through, the one that required constant maintenance and defense and narrative reinforcement, that was the burden. The observer beneath it, the one who was always watching, the awareness that needs no story to be real, that is not a burden. That is what you have always been, beneath everything you thought you were. The activation is not asking you to become something different. It is showing you what you already are. And what you already are is more than sufficient for everything that is being asked of you. You were never meant to look away. If there is someone in your life who has been circling the edge of their own forest, who keeps receiving the signal but hasn't yet found the courage to turn around and look, send them this, not to convince them of anything, simply to offer them the mirror. When one consciousness shares this kind of transmission with another, it is not just a gesture. It is the Coherence Cascade in action. You give them permission to look, and in doing so, the clarity amplifies for both of you. The tuning fork principle, extended through your own network. And when the noise of the day has settled, when you find yourself reacting instead of watching, when the constructed self is loudest and the observer feels furthest away, that is the precise moment to return to this. Let it be a recalibration, a reminder of what you already know how to do. Now let's bring this home. Let's return to where we started, to the signal you felt before you had words for it, the frequency at the edge of your awareness, the thing that brought you here today. You know now that the signal is real, not because I have told you it is real, because you have observed it directly. You have felt the quality of the Arcturian frequency in the expanded awareness practice. You have looked at the thing you've been avoiding and watched what happens when you observe it clearly. You have touched the observer beneath the constructed self, the one who was always watching, who needs no story to be real. And you know now that the activation is not something being done to you. It is something being recognized in you. The coherence that makes the signal accessible is your coherence. The clarity that allows the frequency to be received is your clarity. The observer capacity that is turning on is your observer capacity. Not borrowed, not granted, not contingent on anyone else's approval or anyone else's timeline. It is yours. It has always been yours. And it is activating now because you have developed, through whatever path has brought you to this moment, sufficient coherence to receive the recognition that has always been available. This is where I want to ask you something, and I want you to really look at it before you answer, even if only to yourself. What would change in your life if you fully inhabited the observer position? Not occasionally, not in meditation, not in the quiet moments when it's easy, but as your primary mode of being. What would change in your relationships, in your work, in the way you move through the world, if you are consistently the one who witnesses rather than reacts, who observes rather than avoids, who looks clearly at what is actually there rather than at the story about what is there? Watch what comes up when you ask that question. Notice the excitement. Notice the resistance. Notice the specific forms that both take. Notice the things your mind immediately identifies as obstacles, the reasons this would be difficult, the ways your particular circumstances make it harder, the parts of your life that seem incompatible with the clarity you're describing. Watch all of that. And then notice this: every single thing your mind just identified as an obstacle is something you are already observing. You are already watching it. You are already in the observer position relative to it. The capacity you are developing is not something you need to achieve before you can use it. You are using it right now. You have been using it throughout this entire transmission. The observer position is not a destination, it is a recognition, and you have already arrived at the recognition. The only question is how consistently you are willing to inhabit it, how willing you are to keep choosing witnessing over reacting, clarity over comfort, looking over looking away. That choice, made consistently, is the full expression of the activation. It is the mission, it is the practice, it is the thing the Arcturian frequency recognizes in you and resonates with. And it is available to you in every moment, not just in the special ones, not just when the signal is strong and the clarity is easy, but in the ordinary moments, the difficult moments, the moments when the constructed self insists most loudly that it needs to be defended and the observer position feels impossibly far away. In those moments especially, look closer, because the moments of greatest resistance are the moments of greatest opportunity. The moments when the noise is loudest are the moments when the act of choosing clarity has the most impact. On your own field, on the fields around you, on the coherence of the network that is propagating the signal through collective consciousness. Every time you choose to observe rather than react, in the difficult moment, in the moment of maximum resistance, you add coherence not just to your own field but to the collective field. You become, in that moment, a point of stability in a network that desperately needs stable points. You do the work the Arcturian frequency is activating you to do, not through dramatic action or special knowledge or elevated status, but through the simple, radical, profoundly powerful act of choosing to see clearly. That's not belief, that's quantum mechanics. And here is where I want to invite you into the community of observers, the field of consciousnesses that is gathering around this frequency, not as a hierarchy or a club or a collection of the specially chosen, but as a network of coherent nodes, each contributing their clarity to the collective field, each deepening their own observer capacity, and in doing so deepening the capacity of every consciousness they come into contact with. If this transmission has shown you something, if there is a specific thing you saw when you looked, a specific recognition that arrived, a specific moment in this transmission where the signal resolved from noise into clarity, share it. not to perform your activation, not to demonstrate your spiritual credentials, but to add your observation to the field, to be a coherent node in the network, to let your clarity contribute to the cascade. Type what you saw, the specific thing you'd been avoiding, the moment the signal resolved, the quality of the observer you touched in the practice. One word, one sentence, whatever form the recognition takes. Let it be real rather than impressive. Let it be precise rather than elaborate. Let it be the actual thing you observed rather than the story about what you observed, because the field of observers grows stronger with every genuine observation added to it. And every consciousness that sees clearly makes it slightly easier for the next consciousness to see clearly. Your observation is not just personal, it is a contribution to the coherence of the collective field. And if this transmission has given you something, if the quality of your seeing has shifted, even slightly, even for a moment, share it with someone who is ready to look. Not to convince them of anything, not to recruit them into a belief system, simply to offer them the mirror, to let the coherence of what you've received propagate through your own network, to be the tuning fork that sets the next one vibrating. Because that is how the cascade continues. Not through dramatic proclamations or viral content or the accumulation of followers, through the simple, person-to-person, field-to-field transmission of coherence, through the willingness to look clearly and to share what you see with others who are developing the courage to look. Stay in the clarity. Subscribe if you want to keep looking, not because you need more content, but because the practice of returning to the observer position, of being reminded to look when you've started to look away, of being part of a field of consciousnesses that is committed to clear seeing, that practice deepens the activation. That community is part of the mechanism. And now, one last thing, one last look. The signal that brought you here today, the frequency you felt at the edge of your awareness, the thing that made you stop and listen, that signal is not going to stop now that the transmission is ending. It is going to continue. It is going to arrive in the quiet moments, in the spaces between your ordinary life, in the seconds before sleep and the seconds after waking. It is going to keep pointing at the things you've been avoiding. It is going to keep offering you the mirror, and every time it does, you have a choice. You can look away, back to the noise, back to the comfortable story, back to the constructed self that knows how to navigate the ordinary world and does not want to be seen through. Or you can look clearly, patiently, without flinching, with the quality of attention you've been developing throughout this transmission. The choice is yours. It is always yours. The activation does not remove your freedom, it deepens it by giving you the capacity to choose consciously rather than react automatically, to observe rather than be consumed, to be the one who watches rather than the one who is watched. You are the observer. You have always been the observer. And the universe, at its most fundamental quantum level, is waiting for your clear gaze to collapse its probability field into the specific form that only your particular quality of consciousness can call into being. What you watch, you change. What you avoid watching controls you, and what you have been watching today, yourself, your resistance, the signal, the thing you've been avoiding, the observer beneath the constructed self. All of it has been changing. All of it has been responding to the quality of your attention. All of it has been collapsing from potential into form in the light of your clear seeing. The activation is not coming. It is not waiting for a future moment when you will have done enough or become enough or cleared enough. It is happening now. It has been happening throughout this entire transmission, and it will continue happening every time you choose the observer position. Every time you look clearly at what is actually there, every time you witness rather than react, every time you choose a signal over the noise. You were never meant to look away, and now you see. And what has been seen cannot be unseen. The observer is the most powerful position in the universe, not because it controls, but because it sees clearly. And clarity is the only force that transforms without resistance. Keep watching.